Good morning. I'm Ernesto Burden, publisher of New Hampshire Business Review, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to our webinar today on business surveillance, protecting yourself and your business. The webinar is sponsored by McLane, Middleton, and Service Credit Union. So thank you to both of them for making this possible. It's a fascinating topic, and it's one that there have been a lot of changes in just over the past couple of years, maybe 3 to 5 years, maybe even fewer than that. And those changes are both technological and legal. And so we have two speakers today who will be able to really give us a good sense of those changes on both sides. So they are Cameron Shilling, Information Privacy and Security Group Chair at McLane Middleton, and Lisa Peterson, AVP Administrative Services for Service Credit Union. So let's bring up both of them and just dive right in. Hey, Cam.
Morning, Ernesto.
Good morning. Thank you for joining us. And Lisa, nice to see you. Oh, did not get your audio there.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Oh, now we got you. Okay, great.
All right.
Welcome.
Thank you.
All right, so as I said, we're gonna dive right in, and just one note before we do, for everybody in the audience who's listening. We probably don't have to say this after 2 years of living online and doing Zoom and GoToMeeting and so forth, but there is a question box, and you can type in questions, and we'd love to have you, if you have some specific questions for the panel, type those in, and I will make sure that we get them asked. So with that noted, we'll dive in, and we're gonna start talking to Lisa about Lisa, tell us a little bit about your role at Service Credit Union and some of the factors that you have to deal with as you're sort of analyzing the technology that you're going to put into place for an institution like a financial institution.
Yeah, thank you. So I've worked for the credit union for 25 years, and you can imagine over 25 years, surveillance has changed dramatically. From videotapes to IP cameras today. And, you know, most of my time spent here, I was responsible for the development and implementation of the security systems and training. And I know that today we're talking, excuse me, specifically about surveillance, but it's a component in amongst other security measures that you put in place to develop a system. And we look at a lot of different things when we're looking at installing a system. And I think the first thing is, what are we trying to accomplish? And, you know, what is the site, maybe specific issue that we might have that we want to use surveillance for?
What would a practical example of that be in terms of what are we trying to accomplish? If you're a financial institution, can you give an example of a site and then a site-specific thing that you would use as sort of measuring stick on what you're trying to accomplish?
Well, I think overall we're required to make sure that we keep our members and our staff safe. So as a financial institution, you know, we're prone to potential robberies. So we certainly use a lot of surveillance as both a deterrent. So our cameras are visible. When you come onto our property, you see that there's cameras. When you walk into our facilities, you can see that there's cameras. That's a deterrent. And then, you know, if something were to happen, it's a means for apprehension. So, you know, you want to consider that you're going to be able to give a photo or video to the police so that they can publish that and potentially get a robber or fraudster or someone like that. So you want to consider, you know, where in your facility you're going.
So that where in the facility is something that probably is going to differ from facility to facility, but when you're thinking about that for your company, I mean, that strategic camera placement, you can't just have one in the middle of the room, right? I think is what you mentioned last time we were talking.
Yeah, no, you know, you really need to think about, again, what are you trying to get? So you might put a 360 camera in the center of your lobby space so you can kind of see where everybody is. But if you're wanting to get a face shot of somebody, that's not necessarily going to be the camera you're going to use. You might want to have a camera at your entry point as somebody's coming in, and having your camera positioned strategically kind of at a choke point where people are entering, so you can get a better face shot. And that will provide you a means for identification of somebody to provide to the police if something goes wrong.
Now, I've noticed that that you know, even when you're talking about the kind of cameras that we're using for a video conference and things like that, those cameras are becoming smarter and smarter about sort of knowing where to look or what to focus on during a conference. You know, somebody starts talking and the camera actually focuses in on them. Are those kind of cameras considerations when you're looking at surveillance systems as well?
We've looked at those. I can't say that those are ones that we like to employ, because if you have a camera that focuses in on you and it's supposed to be getting the whole area, it's no longer recording the whole area. So they have their place, and you just, again, you need to think of what you want to get out of that camera.
Right. Okay, great. What about, let's switch to Cam for a minute and just bring you into the conversation and talk a little bit about, Lisa mentioned the changes in the technology, you know, from film cameras to digital now. What are some of the changes in the laws that people should be aware of? Because these, I think, have changed quite a bit in a fairly short amount of time.
Absolutely. You know, Ernesto, I think just like everything has changed with technology and video surveillance over the last 5 to 7 years, everything has changed with respect to the law as well. So historically, we really only had one type of law that governed the capturing of this type of content, and that's the wiretap statutes. And now we have multiple different series of laws that apply in a couple of different ways. So first of all, we have laws that govern the privacy of information. Those laws essentially tell us that when we capture certain types of information, that individuals have rights with respect to that information. They have the right to be told that we're capturing it, what we're capturing, how we're using it, and what we'll do with it. They have rights with respect to telling us what they would like us to do with it, including potentially deleting it or giving them a copy of it. So these are all privacy rights that have arisen really in the last 3 to 5 years. There are general privacy rights statutes in various states and countries that apply to residents of those places, even if they're in different states or countries. We have industry-specific laws in industries like healthcare, banking, education, schools, that type of stuff. And we have laws that apply specifically to video surveillance, and particularly that circumscribe what can be the subject of video surveillance. So for instance, in New Hampshire, we have a law that prohibits the videotaping of anything that would be considered a private space. So that would certainly include places like bathrooms and locker rooms, but also could include places like private offices and stuff like that. So the whole world of laws with respect to video surveillance have changed. That's the privacy side. And then there's a whole security side too, as well. So.
And talk a little bit about that, about the security side of it.
Sure. So privacy and security laws are the different ends of the cyber field. So privacy tells us what the rules are, what we can do with people's information, but the security rules tell us what we must do to keep information from being lost or stolen. So when we're gathering video surveillance, whether it includes audio or not, we commonly are gathering some types of sensitive personal information. At the very least, we may be acquiring people's images, and images to some extent are biometric information now, particularly if the images are sufficient to provide facial recognition, because facial recognition is a type of biometric information. But there's other types of sensitive information we may be gathering. For instance, if we're videotaping the entrance to a medical facility, we may be getting health information or stuff like that. So what these laws tell us is if we're going to get sensitive information, we have to protect it. And protection starts from the time we start gathering it at the lens of the camera, all the way through the wires that we collected or the wireless connections to where we store it, who has access to it, where we put it in a cloud, all that type of stuff. We have to provide appropriate security from end to end for video surveillance because it commonly does contain sensitive information.
Yeah, and that sort of brings me back to thinking about hardware concepts, and maybe Lisa, this would be something that you could talk a little bit about, is when you were making hardware decisions for systems that are going to protect the service credit union facilities, what are some of the driving factors in these hardware decisions? And I mean this fairly facetiously, but you're not like just going down to Best Buy and picking out some cameras, right?
No.
Where do you begin when you're thinking about hardware?
Yeah, so, we're looking at the data security. Is it going to be able to be hacked, through our security system? So fortunately, we have an IT department that provides us with secure IP addresses, but also, we're putting complex passwords on our recorder and on the cameras to, again, provide, not allow people to hack in to those devices because they are on a network.
Yeah. Are the devices themselves, are the vendors who are providing security systems typically, are they also providing security sort of recommendations and analysis as, let's say, somebody's out there shopping for this? And presumably our listeners today are maybe in a position where they want to be considering a security system. What are they looking for from a vendor? And that's open question to both of you, I think.
Well, I guess I'll go.
Go ahead, Lisa. You start and I'll fill in.
Okay, perfect. So yeah, your security provider is going to give you a wealth of information. I mean, these systems have these functionalities built into them, and that's a selling point for them. So I think you just ask them the question, how is the data secured on this system? And they're going to tell you, and it's going to depend on what your installation is as to how complex that will be.
And I'll add to that. So a couple of things. First of all, for a business looking to implement a video surveillance system, you really should be working with a credentialed security expert to do this. This is not something that you're typically going to do for yourself. When you find an entity like this, and there's several really good ones in our area, they will be telling you a couple of things. They'll be providing you with information about the physical hardware, so the cameras, the wiring if it's wired, the wireless if it's wired, and the computer or server that it gets stored on. They'll be able to tell you about the security features of that, but also hardware doesn't work alone. The software is really where the protective controls come in place. And good quality security experts will be able to talk to you about who the software vendor is, what their controls are, and the like. And this is the last thing I'll say about this is trust but verify. The problem with cybersecurity is that most business owners don't really know the nuances of it. So if you're not entirely sure you can trust the security vendor you're using, talk to your IT vendor or talk to a cybersecurity lawyer and have them get the information, have them talk to the security consultant with you, because a lot of this stuff can be really complex and beyond most people's understanding. So just make sure that trust but also verify.
I think that makes sense. And what's interesting again is, like, not to belabor the point of how much things have changed, how quickly, but this feels analogous to me in terms of like when managing companies' websites and GDPR came about, and all of a sudden there was this massive new set of rules that had to do with the data that you collected on people, whether what you were doing with cookies, the various third-party vendors that were providing content to your website or taking data out of your website, and all of that had to be listed in really specific ways. Cam, what, like, that GDPR is something that's actually relevant even though it's European, it's relevant for folks here in the States too, right? Even on the video surveillance sense.
Absolutely. So a couple of things. So that's really a great segue into the major compliance area with respect to privacy laws. So in 2018, when GDPR became effective, we all got used to seeing those banners that are along the bottom of the websites where it says, we record certain information or we record cookies, click accept to accept. That accept button is a form of consent. And the little notice you get with the link to the privacy policy is notice. So the first tenet of privacy law is notice and consent. Tell people what information that you're getting information, what information you're getting, how you're using it. That's the privacy policy, and then get their consent. But with video surveillance, it's a little harder. When someone walks onto your campus or into your facility, you can't really get them to click something, not at least in that way. And so we have to do it a bit differently. And I'll talk about that in a sec. But in addition to kind of GDPR coming into being, almost every state, I think, if not every state now, has a law on video surveillance privacy. And these laws essentially tell us what we can collect, but also they're essentially telling us to get consent, and particularly for certain types of information, we have to have consent. But because it's hard to kind of splice between what you need consent for versus what you can just provide notice for, we almost always go to the consent model. So it's tough to do this because you can't get people to click on a button when they're walking up in a place. And the privacy laws are telling us that just posting a sign is not necessarily enough. A sign is when a person walks into a facility that has a sign on it, they're impliedly consenting to something, but these laws are requiring more. They're requiring express consent. So where we're going with businesses is getting consent from, say, employees. That's doable. You can get consent when you hire them, when they're signing the employee handbook, stuff like that. But also getting consent with people who are coming on your coming into your facilities, whether they're customers or whatnot. Oftentimes, businesses will have customers sign in, and the consent can be included in a sign-in, or with vendors, there may be confidentiality agreements and consents can be packed into those. So we're really looking for places to implement affirmative consent if a company is doing video surveillance.
It's interesting because when we were talking before the call, one of the things that I had noted was I don't recall ever hitting the consent button like when I walk into a doctor's office, for example. And you pointed out that all the HIPAA privacy forms that you sign when you sign on that little electronic pad on your way into the office are probably contain that consent.
Exactly right.
What's interesting about that is, like, even that though, I don't sign those until I've actually come in, been in the waiting room for a while, and then gone up. Does the law not care about that? Or do you see down the road a point where it's going to get so strict that you're going to need that consent the minute you walk on the property?
I don't think it's going to be that strict. Cybersecurity and privacy laws have flexibility built into them. And the way the laws read is that they want us to get consent at the earliest possible opportunity, but there's absolute flexibility built into these laws. So this is, and the other thing I'd say is these laws are not about requiring perfection. There's no way to be perfect in this world with respect to cybersecurity and cyber privacy. And so really what these laws are telling us is, you got to make reasonable, meaningful efforts to provide notice and get consent as much as you possibly can. And look, I'm happy with 95 to 98%. Let's just get there because, most of us are still not close to that. So I'd be happy if we get the consent after you've walked up to the counter, as opposed to walked in the door.
Well, very much related to what we're talking about right now, I just got a question from the audience that I will throw out there, which is, what's a New Hampshire employer obligated to do in way of informing and getting consent from employees?
So it depends on what law we're talking about. For the wiretap statute, if we're video recording audio, if, in other words, if our video surveillance or if our surveillance includes audio, then we just have to notify. And that's typically done through prominent signage. So when employees walk in or when visitors walk in, the sign tells them that there's audio recording going on, video recording, and by entering these premises, they're consented. That works for the wiretap statutes. But it doesn't work for the New Hampshire video privacy law. The New Hampshire video privacy law goes a little further. It tells us that we cannot, so the New Hampshire law still works in that way for people coming onto the premises. So any public areas, under New Hampshire law, we can video record that without getting consent under the New Hampshire law, at least, not necessarily true in other states. But as soon as we videotape anything that is deemed to be a potentially private area, someplace where someone might have, and this is what the law says, an expectation of privacy, then we need consent. So obviously we're not going to videotape in bathrooms, we're not going to videotape in locker rooms, but offices are, a question mark still under New Hampshire law. Conference rooms are a question mark. So that's why if we're going to do any sort of video surveillance in those types of areas, then we're going to need to get consent. And that has to be express consent. It has to be a sign off. You can't just post signs under the New Hampshire video privacy law and get consent.
So this would be something that you, like a form that Human Resources would have everybody sign?
Correct. And it would be a form for employees, and you'd just pack it into something that employees normally sign, typically an employment handbook. For customers and vendors, vendors, a lot of times we're having them sign a confidentiality agreement when they come in, but we can also do this via a sign-in sheet. There can be a provision at the bottom of a sign-in sheet that talks about the fact that there's a video and audio surveillance going on the property. It's usually incorporated with a confidentiality provision, and the sign-in sheet can be sufficient notice and consent.
I feel like these days you could just get a digital pad right out front that had all that plus your COVID status, and whether you had a temperature or not, and that sort of thing. It's very the complexity of having guests in the office has increased quite a bit over the past couple of years. I wondered, just quickly going back, oh, I got another audience question before I go back. I wanted to go back and talk about hardware a little bit more, but
we love audience questions.
Yes, so I'm not gonna miss those. So in New Hampshire, if the only place we have a camera is outside the front door, is written sign-in or affirmative consent required?
Probably not. That's almost certainly going to be considered a public space. But nonetheless, even though you have a camera there, you still need to have signage. The camera itself is probably not prominent enough to be telling people, hey, they're being video recorded.
So
Those big yellow signs with the picture of the camera on them that we've all seen.
Well, just out of curiosity, does that apply for private citizens too? You know, so if you're like, you know, how you're walking down the street and you see somebody at their house says a smile, you're on camera kind of sign. Is that required for private residents as well?
Yes, there's no differentiation under these privacy laws about who's doing the recording.
Interesting. So everybody who has a Ring doorbell ought to have a sign to comply with the law?
Yeah, if you want to be in absolute compliance with the law, yes.
Wow, I can only imagine the number of infractions that are out there if you were to survey the population at the moment.
Yep, and you know, remember, we're only talking about video recording too. These laws don't apply to live video feeds. So if you're not recording the video, then the law isn't going to apply. And there's a lot of video surveillance that's done on live feed.
How can you get into that in a little more detail? What does that mean? Like, so if it's live and you're just not capturing it anywhere, what's the purpose of just having a live feed that's not being recorded?
Well, live feeds are used oftentimes at the entrances of buildings so that the receptionist or other people can see who's there and buzz them in. Or it's done to determine, you know, what's going on in a particular place. There are places where live feeds are done. And one of the reasons is because places like front doors tend to generate a lot of video content. And the retaining of all of that content is memory intensive. So a lot of places feel that they just don't need to record that. Also, as soon as you record something, we talked about this, as soon as you record something that could have potentially sensitive information on it, you have to secure it. And so one way of lessening your security burden is just to not record content that you don't think you need to record.
Yeah. Now, even in a live feed, are there it seems like there would be security considerations though, right? Because that would also still be hackable.
It's possible, although most of your security concerns around live feeds are who can see the live feed. Most live feeds are going to be closed circuit, so it's going to go to one particular or a couple of particular screens. And so really the bigger concern is protecting the screen where the live feed goes to. So if you have a live feed and only a live feed, your security concerns, I mean, you still have them because someone could in theory hack into the live feed, but they're lessened. Most entities that are going to have a live feed are also going to do some other form of video surveillance, and their live feed is going to be packed into their video surveillance system. So they're going to have security around the whole surveillance system, which will also encompass the live feed.
Yeah. Okay. And Lisa, one of the things that just came up was the idea of storage and the benefit of having a live feed versus a feed that you're storing is that you don't have to deal with all that data that you're collecting. You guys have storage issues, and one of the things that we talked about when we were preparing for this call was the idea of a big question, I think, in determining what kind of surveillance system you're going to have and how you set it up is whether you're going to store your data in the cloud or on premise. And you guys had to make those decisions. I'm wondering if you can talk through that a little bit for those who might be thinking cloud or.
Sure. So we have a lot of facilities and we use a lot of cameras. So when we considered the cloud, we didn't feel like that was going to work for us. It wasn't cost effective. It wasn't network effective for us to pull that much video data over our network. So we have opted to use what they call an NVR, or a network video recorder, which stores the data locally at our sites. So, and then still when you're buying a recorder, you still need to consider the cameras and how many cameras, how long you're going to store data, so that you know what size you need to have in order to store it for the period of time you want to retain that for. Video takes up a lot of storage room.
And how do you keep that kind of data for forever, or do you have a expiration date on that?
Yeah, no, we do not keep it forever. We keep it for a specific period of time and then it's gone. Generally, the way the system that we're using it works is it will keep what they call all data, and then it will like delete non-motion data over a period of time, and then it will just delete all of the data after a period of time. But because some of the crime that we experience may happen, later than sooner, so we do retain it for a period of time.
Yeah, and even though you're storing the data on premise at individual facilities, you still have access to it all from a sort of central location. What does that workflow look like or feel like?
So yeah, so we're able, it's specifically assigned. Not every user has, you have very specific capabilities that you can assign. And then for me, I can log into a site and pull up what I need to look at for that location to do some research.
Okay. Another question here coming in from the audience. This is, how does the bill Congress recently passed banning Chinese equipment from, I think it's Hikvision, Dahao, and others apply in New Hampshire? And Cam, do you have any insight into that?
I'm not sure I can answer that with enough specificity. If Ernesto, if you want to connect me with the person asking the question offline, we can probably get some more information about that.
Sure, and let's see, I will do that. And it's an interesting question though, because that does, I mean, from a security perspective, that seems like that's been in the news a lot lately. Not only those companies, but also like Huawei or TikTok. as another.
So there's a really good reason to rely on a security expert who's gonna really keep in tune with the equipment that can be used in the United States versus equipment that's on the prohibited list. So like if you asked me that question, what information can and can't be used, I'd be calling one of my security people and say, okay, which equipment just got crossed off because of the federal bill?
Another question from the audience. This is great, audience. Keep them coming. And what are the potential penalties for failure to obtain consent when necessary to record video or audio? And Cam, maybe you could give that answer and give some examples of what you've seen happen here in the state.
Yeah. So it depends on what law you're talking about. A violation of the wiretap statute, which generally applies if you're recording audio and you don't do it the right way. There's a couple of different penalties. One is, in theory, a violation of the wiretap statute is a crime. And also imposes civil liability. So in theory, a local or state official could prosecute you for violating the wiretap statute. Does that happen very often? No, it happens rarely, and it almost only happens for egregious violations or ongoing violations. But at the same time, the wiretap statute creates civil liability. So if you are audio taping in violation of the statute, the person who you're taping can bring a civil cause of action. And normally the damages are pretty small, but there's also statutory damages that get imposed. There's some monetary liability. One of the biggest remedies that's commonly applied for wiretap statute violations is that the fact is that you can't use the audio. It's called the exclusionary rule. So if you want to use it in your own lawsuit to prove that somebody stole something or vandalized your property or something like that, the evidence can't be used. It gets excluded if it's obtained in violation of the wiretap statute. And usually the way this stuff happens is clients come to us saying, I want to pursue this claim, I want to fire this employee, or I have this evidence in my family law case. I don't want to use it, and we have to say, well, this is great evidence, but it's all been obtained in violation of the wiretap statute, can't be used. And if you do use it, you're just showing the world and the opposing party that you've obtained information illegally. The video surveillance statutes are not as clear as to what the remedies are. There's no criminal penalty yet, at least. Almost certainly this will raise civil liability questions, so possible monetary component, but no exclusionary rule. So it's a little less clear on what the outcome's going to be of violating the video surveillance rules.
That's fascinating. So you could have video evidence of somebody committing a crime, and they could make the argument that the video was obtained without their consent, and therefore it's not valid. Would that, and I presume that would apply. You said that the laws are the same for private residences as businesses. Does that apply to things like nanny cams and whatnot? Absolutely. We put together agreements for clients with nannies, and one of the provisions is if we're going to do video or audio surveillance, we get their consent to it. So absolutely. And the police, this often, what happens oftentimes when these private conflicts occur is the police get called in, and they're in a position of having to evaluate, was this evidence taken lawfully or unlawfully, and sometimes by virtue of calling the police in to report a robbery, what you're doing is effectively reporting that you're obtaining video or audio illegally yourself. So it can be a problem. Wow. That is that I still like. I don't have a camera at my house, but I feel like I wouldn't. I feel like there are a lot of people who may have cameras at their house who, were they to watch this webinar, would be surprised by the legal obligations that they have around those. An easy question from the audience. I'll take this one. Will the recording of this webinar be available? Absolutely. Everybody in the audience. We'll all get an email with a link to this recording afterwards, and feel free to share it with others. Wanted to go back a little bit to what talking again about the changes in technology. What kind of cameras specifically, Lisa, do you guys use? If you can tell me that. I don't know how much you could tell me from a security perspective or not, but are you, what are some of the specific camera features that you were looking for that drove that decision?
Well, I think we use a whole variety of cameras that will serve different purposes. I think the one that we're probably is a newer one that has really great capabilities is the 360 camera. And so we're looking for quality, and we're looking for, obviously now color is all, standard. We're using IP cameras. Those are pretty standard now, which they weren't in the past. But where, again, it really depends on multi-lens cameras for maybe a parking lot space where you can have one camera, one network feed, and, have it facing in different directions. So a brand name that comes to mind is Axis. They have a whole variety of really excellent cameras that we like to use.
Is that ACCES or AXIS?
AXIS.
AXIS. And so with a multi-lens camera, because I'm not familiar with that technology, what does that do? So it's one camera with two lenses pointing in two different directions. It comes in one feed, and then does it come up on two different screens, or does it come up in a split screen so you're seeing both things at the same time?
Depends on the software you're using, but generally you can get 2 to 4 lenses. So I can have one, I guess, picture a 360 broken into 4 different components looking at 4 different directions. So if you think of a parking lot that has, 2 lanes on either side, you can have camera facing, 4 different areas of the parking lot. So just very convenient to have the wiring for that be as one camera, but the view can be very encompassing.
Okay, and we have a note here from the audience. Michael Banks points out that Axis is based in Chelmsford, Massachusetts. And so local company, that's really cool.
Yeah.
And endorses them as a great company. So another question that has come in, if a criminal enters a recorded facility knowingly breaking and entering and commits theft, for example, does the wiretap law still take effect? That is, do you need to get consent from a criminal to record their activities?
So potentially, sure. The question really is not so much, is consent going to, did you need to get that person's consent, but whether or not the video is going to be admissible with respect to the prosecution. So the law is you have to get consent if you're going to record in private places, and it doesn't differentiate between who is there or for what reason. So, but again, remember, if you're going to record places where a criminal is likely to break in, you're probably going to be recording public places, the outside of buildings, hallways, reception areas, that type of stuff, as opposed to private places. So, hey, and I did just check, Ernesto, this the New Hampshire video surveillance law has now been classified as it's a Class A misdemeanor to violate it. So there is now a criminal penalty, albeit small, but a criminal penalty for violating the statute. But remember, you use that kind of nanny cam example, or potentially a business example. If you're reporting to the police a crime that's occurred, and you're showing them the video you have that you obtained in violation of the video privacy law, you may be admitting to your own Class A misdemeanor. So.
And then also not having admissible evidence for the actual thing that you were trying to report.
Possible. So the wiretap statute has a specific exclusionary rule that says you can't use it. The video surveillance statute doesn't necessarily have that, but that doesn't necessarily mean that a court wouldn't impose the exclusionary rule on its own.
One can imagine a sort of Kafka-esque science fiction story you could write around that situation, right?
Yeah. I think the moral of the story here is if you're going to use video surveillance, post a lot of really good signage and limit it to public spaces. If you're going to record anything that's private, get the consent of the people who are going to be in the private spaces, which is usually your employees and your visitors. Get their consent, because you can do it.
And this, thinking about the question that you had just responded to, which was the criminal enters the facility knowingly breaking and entering and whatnot. In the case that they're entering, if there are cameras outside, there are cameras inside, is there also a distinction between implied consent and express consent in that situation? Is implied consent sufficient in the case where where somebody's breaking in, I guess?
No, implied consent is a different concept than express consent. The only way you get express consent is to have somebody sign something, click a box, auditorially indicate that they agree. It is an affirmative act of consent. Implied consent is totally different.
But implied consent would be like if you have a sign in a public space that says, I'm recording a video, right? So that all of that video would be admissible for that person breaking in and climbing through the window and going down the main hall or whatever.
Yeah, so just to be legally, technically correct, you don't have to get consent at all for video recording in public places. And the most the privacy laws would require there is notice. So prominent signage gives you notice. It also can give you implied consent. But so you don't need consent for recording public spaces. You just need consent for recording private spaces.
Which does bring to mind something that we talked about as a group preparing for the call, which is that there are some institutions like municipalities and things like that that are not that they're outside, carved out of these laws in general, right? Maybe you could talk a little bit about that, because we all see the idea that I think Britain is very famously cameras everywhere, right?
Right. So there are all kinds of carve-outs in these statutes that apply to governmental actors. So, for instance, some of the attendees may be familiar with this big European law called GDPR. Well, GDPR exempts governmental entities that conduct surveillance. Another huge exemption is surveillance for legitimate law enforcement means, which is obviously an exemption under the New Hampshire law. Another common exemption is surveillance for traffic control and traffic monitoring, which pretty much can apply to any camera that gets stuck on a roadway. So the effect of these exemptions are that governmental actors largely are outside the law unless they're specifically doing, targeted surveillance or surveillance within a private space, like a home or something like that.
So that when you say law enforcement, it makes me think, of course, first of body cams on police officers, and they are not having to ask for consent before they turn those on. So
correct.
And so another question came up, and just to clarify, if you videotape live and recorded your employees, you need signage and written consent.
If you're videotaping employees in a public space, so reception area, lunchroom, the work floor, hallways, outside your building, parking lots, only notice, just tell them with signage. And not a bad thing to tell them in your employment handbook as well. If you're going to conduct video surveillance in places that could be private places, then you need to get their consent, some sign off somewhere. So what are private spaces? We definitely know that bathrooms, locker rooms are private spaces. I wouldn't tell you should do surveillance there, even if you do get consent. But there are some places that are going to do surveillance in locker rooms and the like, particularly different types of locker rooms. But ask yourself, what is a private place? Because that's not entirely clear under the statute. Offices and conference rooms could very well be private spaces. Take, for example, a law firm. I would consider our conference rooms to be private spaces. And so if we're going to video record there, we're going to want to get consent.
So stepping back in the last couple minutes that we have, we've talked a lot about sort of the technology used for video surveillance and the laws governing video surveillance. Maybe one question that we didn't touch on was, how do I know as a business owner whether I need to do video surveillance? And I think, like Lisa, you had addressed a number of things that helped you determine what kind of surveillance you would do. And I think some of those things are the same things that would help maybe a business determine if they were going to need to do it at all. You mentioned when we were chatting things like crime rate and traffic and stuff. What are some of the factors that you would look at if you were running a different business than yours, say a small business? what would you look at to say, do I need this? Like, is the trade-off of the expense and the liability, potentially the legal challenges, is it worth it?
I think I'd look first at, have I had any experience with any crime where video or photos would have been helpful? Am I subject to a robbery? Is that something that, my business is, I guess I think convenience stores are a location that, you think of being robbed. So in those cases, you might want to have video, right? Because you want to have apprehension capabilities. One of the things that I always think, if the robber doesn't get caught, then their incentive to come back is pretty high, or to have someone do a repeat of that. So I think it's a good idea to make sure that you have good surveillance to give to the police. But also the deterrent factor, having your cameras out in the parking lot and really visible is a great deterrent. They know that they are on video. And some of the locations that we have, I've put a monitor in the lobby so you can see yourself coming in. You may not agree that that would be a deterrent, but if it's a location where I'm concerned, any additional deterrent, I think, is a good one. So it depends, I guess shops might have problems with theft. So you may want to have it in an area where you feel like items are being stolen. It needs to be specific to where you feel your problems are and, what you want to do to try to resolve that. It may be that you are just moving those items to a more visible area. Maybe cameras aren't necessary. So putting locks on them. There's a whole host of different things you can do for security issues. But those are the things that I'm looking at. Have you had problems with graffiti? That's a thing where, loitering, sometimes like kiosk areas where you have an ATM, you might have problems with people coming in and sleeping overnight. That's problematic for others coming in. So there can be any number of different reasons that, different types of surveillance is very helpful.
Yeah, and it sounds like, and based on all of those sort of different circumstances that you just described, it also sounds like there's probably a tremendous range of expense and systems that you could employ to solve some of those problems, from very small scale setups to the kind of giant setup that you manage.
Yeah, absolutely. If I can now look at my facilities that I'm renovating and construct them in a way that is minimizing my need for surveillance, I'm going to do that. So.
Oh, that's a really interesting point. Cam, what about you? Any thoughts on that topic?
Yeah, so surveillance is great for security with respect to outside individuals, like Lisa's talking about, but a lot of businesses are using it for their own internal purposes as well. So it can be used not so much from a security standpoint, but more from a monitoring standpoint with respect to employees. So monitoring time clocks, entrances, exits, lunchrooms, that type of area where you just want to monitor employees. There could be disciplinary issues that are assisted by having video surveillance. But also, some employers really use video effectively for performance enhancement, not discipline, but really studying how particular workplaces operate, manufacturing lines operate, individuals operate, and with the eye towards making the workplace a better place, operate better, figure out better ways, more efficient ways to do it. So it's not just a great tool for security, but also can be a great tool for efficiency.
Interesting. That sounds like, are there specific kinds of business where that where that really jumps out as a factor? It would be like manufacturing, shipping, warehousing, things like that.
Quality control, manufacturing, shipping, highly technical fields where individuals are needing to interact in a way that isn't always visible, where video surveillance can come in. So microchips, certain microchip manufacturers have uses for video surveillance that not just records the individuals operating, but what the individuals are seeing. Those are the main ones that I can think of.
Well, it seems like that would be a slightly different kind of system in terms of maybe not the capture side, but the retrieval and analysis side. If you were recording for workflow analysis for manufacturing, for example, it seemed like you'd be looking at that data in a very different way than you would if you were just trying to find the person who stole something.
Yep, absolutely. And in a lot of instances that the video is captured, analyzed, and then the raw data footage is not always kept. And the business systems that do the analysis are very data intensive and memory intensive, and are always operating right on top of the video system. So it tends to be a significant security issue.
Well, on that note, I think that we're just about at the top of the hour, and so I want to thank you both, and also thank the audience we had great questions and really good feedback from people. Again, this will be available for download after the fact, and feel free to share it with people. I know I learned some things that I had no idea of, and I think that many of us did today. So super valuable. Cam Shilling, Lisa Peterson, thank you both. Wonderful job. I feel like we could keep going at this for quite a while. Sad we only get an hour. I also want to thank our sponsors today, who are McLane, Middleton, and Service Credit Union. They make this possible, and they're great supporters of New Hampshire Business Review, so we appreciate that very much. And with that, I hope that you all have a wonderful rest of the week.
Thank you, Ernesto. Thank you, Lisa. Bye-bye.